I'm a widowed father of triplets. For 4 years, my tired joke, no woman wants to be mom to triplets by dinner. It was my armor. Then the Sunday school teacher, Maggie, heard me. She didn't laugh. She whispered, "I've prayed for this. 6 years I've prayed to be their mother." My daughter Lily said, "She already tucks us in when you fall asleep." I was the last to know. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a woman who prayed for 6 years to mother 3 girls she didn't give birth to, of children who kept a secret comfort from their grieving father, and of a man so buried in survival he almost missed the family forming right in front of him. Maggie wasn't just kind. She was paying anonymous donations, filling out foster applications, writing each girl's name in a prayer journal. Everyone knew but him. So how did a joke unmask a 6-year act of faith? To understand that, we go back 4 years, to a rainy night when a young father learned how fast a life can shatter. I remember the rain. It hammered our roof like fists the night my wife died. I was 30 years old, half asleep in the recliner, one hand draped over Lily's crib because she was running a fever and I'd promised Sarah I'd stay close. The phone rang at 2 in the morning. A state trooper. Her car had hydroplaned on the interstate, spun into a guardrail and flipped. They said she was gone before the ambulance arrived. I didn't cry at first. I couldn't. I had 3 4-month-old daughters in the next room who still needed to be fed every 3 hours. I remember standing in the nursery doorway, staring at 3 little bundles wrapped in pink, and thinking, I don't know how to do this alone. I don't know how to be enough for all 3 of them. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and handshakes. People from the church came in waves. They prayed, they hugged me, they told me God had a plan. I nodded and thanked them, but inside I was screaming. What plan leaves 3 infant girls without a mother? What plan rips away the only woman who ever saw me as more than a ranch hand? After the last guest left, I locked the door and slid down against it. The silence in the house was terrifying. No Sarah humming in the kitchen. No sound of her rocking chair. Just a bassinet monitor crackling and the occasional whimper of a baby who didn't understand why her mother's scent was fatting from the blankets. That's when I built the armor. It started as a coping mechanism, a shield against the endless well-meaning questions at church and the feed store. How do you manage, John? 3 bobbies, a ranch all by yourself. I'd force a smile and say, no woman in her right mind wants to be mom to triplets by dinner. The words would land with a chuckle. People would shake their heads and pat my shoulder. But underneath the joke was a truth I wasn't brave enough to speak aloud. I believed no one would ever really want us. Not the broken man, not the ready-made chaos of 3 little girls. We were a package deal with too much baggage. The years blurred. I learned to braid hair watching YouTube tutorials at midnight. I learned to cook macaroni 18 different ways because it was the only thing all 3 would eat at the same time. I learned that grief doesn't shrink. You just grow around it like a tree swallowing a fence wire. The ranch nearly went under twice. The first time, 6 months after Sarah died, I couldn't make payroll for the 2 hands I employed. I was drowning in medical bills from her emergency C-section and the NICU stay. Our insurance had lapsed during my father's cancer treatment the year before. I sold half the cattle at a loss. Then, a week before I was set to lay off the last ranch hand, an envelope arrived at the church office addressed to me. Inside was a cashier's check for $7,000. No name. Just a typed note, for the girls. I asked Pastor Bill who left it. He said he didn't know. A woman, he thought, but she'd slipped in during evening prayer and slipped out before anyone could speak to her. The second time, 2 years later, the well pump failed. Cost to replace it, $11,000. Again, an envelope. This time, a money order dropped through the mail slot at 2 a.m. No note, no signature. Just enough to cover the pump. I told myself it was God. It felt easier than believing a person could care that much without wanting something in return. Through it all, Maggie was just there. A quiet Sunday school teacher with auburn hair she always wore in a loose braid and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. She'd started volunteering at the church the same year Sarah got pregnant, which meant she'd been around for 6 years now. She'd known Sarah briefly before the accident. They'd sat together in the women's Bible study. Maggie never pushed. She never asked me out for coffee. She never said the things I saw in other women's eyes. Pity, calculation, or worse, that look that said I'd be a project. Instead, she simply appeared at the edges of our need. The girls would come home from Sunday school with their dresses mended, tiny stitches where Lily had torn a seam climbing the fence. She'd pack extra lunches in my backpack on field trip days, the same way Sarah used to, with handwritten notes tucked inside. I'd find them hours later. Jesus loves you, sweetheart, be brave. I assumed they were for the girls. I never stopped to wonder who was feeding me. I should have seen it sooner. The nightmare started when the triplets were 3. Lily would wake screaming, convinced monsters were in her closet. Emma would sob for her mother's voice. Grace would just stand silently beside my bed, trembling, unable to speak. I was so exhausted from 16-hour days on the ranch that sometimes I slept through the monitor. In the mornings, I'd find them all in the living room, curled up together under a quilt, breakfast already cleaned up. I'd ask if they'd been scared. They'd say, "No, Miss Maggie prayed with us until we fell asleep." I thought they meant she'd called. I never asked when she had a key. The prayer journal was the first real crack in my blindness. Maggie left her bag in the church pew one Sunday, and Lily, bold, curious Lily, dug through it while I was talking to Pastor Bill. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook and flipped it open. She could barely read, but she recognized her name, and Emma's and Grace's, all written in neat, careful cursive, each one accompanied by a date and a handwritten prayer. January 12th, that God would give Lily courage to be tender, not just brave. March 4th, that Emma would feel her mother's love through me. August 22nd, that Grace would speak her pain instead of burying it. The entries went back years. I caught Lily before I could read more. I told her to respect privacy. I put the journal back. I didn't open it. I didn't open it because I couldn't. Because if I opened it, I'd have to face that someone had been carrying my daughters in her heart long before I'd ever noticed. The church picnic was the last Sunday of September. The whole congregation gathered out at Miller's Grove, a stretch of grass under old oaks with picnic tables and a makeshift stage. The girls were 6 now, all energy and scraped knees. Lily had immediately claimed Maggie as her personal companion. Emma and Grace fought over who got to sit in her lap first. I stood off to the side, holding a cup of cold coffee, watching Maggie balance 2 of my daughters on her knees while the third, Grace, stood behind her, weaving daisies into her hair. Someone clapped me on the back. Old man Henderson, whose wife had died 20 years ago, raised his eyebrows at the scene. "Looks like your girls have found a new mother figure, eh, John? You ever think about finding a wife?" He meant it kindly. They all did. I didn't even think. The joke surfaced on instinct, a reflex hardened by 4 years of deflection. I gestured toward Maggie with my coffee cup and said it loud enough for the nearby table to hear. "No woman in her right mind wants to be mom to triplets by dinner." The laughter rippled. Henderson chuckled. 2 women from the choir exchanged knowing glances. The joke did its job. It shut down the conversation. It kept the wall standing. I was already turning away, already retreating back into the comfortable shell of the widower who didn't need anyone when Maggie's voice cut through. She wasn't laughing. "I've prayed for this." I froze mid-step. The coffee cup stopped halfway to my lips. The world around us seemed to mute. The children shouting, the sound of a guitar tuning, even the breeze through the oaks. It all fell away. Maggie was looking at me with a steadiness that made my chest tighten. Her voice was so quiet I almost believed I'd imagined it. "For them, for you, for 6 years I've prayed God would let me be their mother." I couldn't move. My brain was trying to process the words, to fit them into the picture I'd constructed of a kind Sunday school teacher who mended dresses and packed lunches out of neighborly charity. But the look in her eyes wasn't neighborly. It wasn't even hopeful. It was the look of someone who had been holding a secret so long it had become a part of her soul. Before I could speak, before I could even exhale, Lily's voice sliced through the silence. She had stopped braiding Grace's hair. She looked up at me with the same matter-of-fact expression she used when explaining why the cat needed 3 breakfasts. "Daddy," she said, "she already tucks us in when you fall asleep in the barn. She's been our mommy in secret." The coffee cup slipped from my hand. It hit the grass without a sound, brown liquid seeping into the dirt like the truth I'd been too broken to see. Lily's words unspooled a hidden tapestry I hadn't dared to imagine. The anonymous donations, the midnight comfort, the foster application Maggie had filled out hopping to take my daughters if my grief ever swallowed me whole. I was the last one to know. And standing there, with three little girls already calling her mother in secret, I realized my joke had never been armor at all. It was just a cage I'd built so well I couldn't see the door had been wide open the whole time. The picnic didn't pause for my collapse. Somewhere behind me, the guitar player started an off-key rendition of Amazing Grace, and a child shrieked with laughter. And old man Henderson was already turning to another conversation, his question about my love life forgotten. But I stood rooted to the grass, staring at Maggie as if she had just spoken in a language I was only beginning to understand. She hadn't moved. Lily was now plucking daisies from Grace's hand and pushing them into Maggie's hair, and Emma had shifted to lean her head against Maggie's shoulder, the easy, unthinking way a child leans against a mother, because that's what Maggie was to them. Not a teacher, not a helper, a mother in secret. The words repeated in my skull. She's been our mommy in secret. How long? How had I missed it? Maggie's gaze was still locked on mine, and I saw it now, the thing I'd ignored for years because it was easier to believe I was alone. It wasn't just steadiness. It was a fierce, quiet patience. The patience of someone who had been waiting for me to wake up. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. What do you say to a woman who has prayed for your children for 6 years, who has slipped into your home while you slept, who has held your daughters through nightmares you couldn't hear? What do you say when you realize the invisible safety net you attributed to God had her fingerprints all over it? She must have seen the panic flooding my face because she gently shifted Emma off her lap and stood. She said something to Lily, who nodded and took Grace's hand, and then Maggie walked toward me. Her steps were careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. "John," she said, and my name in her mouth felt like a key turning in a lock I'd forgotten existed. "Can we talk? Somewhere quiet." I nodded, still mute. I led her away from the crowd, through a copse of oak trees to a bench near the creek that bordered Miller's Grove. The water ran low and clear over smooth stones, and the noise of the picnic faded to a distant murmur. We sat down, a foot of wooden slats between us, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. When she started, her voice was so soft I had to lean in. "I didn't mean to say it that way. I've imagined this conversation 100 times, and every time it went differently." "How did you imagine it?" I finally managed. My voice was hoarse. Maggie looked down at her hands, which were calloused in a way I'd never noticed before, from gardening maybe, or from the work of mending a family that wasn't hers. "I imagined you'd be ready, that you'd see me not as a threat but as someone who has loved your daughters since before they could walk, since before Sarah." She stopped at my wife's name. I felt the old ache twist in my chest, but it was different now. It wasn't just grief, it was guilt. Guilt that I hadn't known someone else had been carrying a piece of my burden all this time. "Tell me everything," I said. She took a breath and began to unspool 6 years of secrets. She told me about the first time she saw us. It was at Sarah's baby shower, a month before the triplets were born. Maggie had just started volunteering at the church, new to town, lonely and rootless. Sarah had been so kind, she said, so full of light. Maggie had watched the way I hovered near Sarah, one hand always on her back, and she'd thought, "That's the kind of love I want." She'd prayed that night not for my family, but for her own sense of belonging. Then the triplets came, and Sarah died, and Maggie told herself it was just tragedy. But she couldn't shake the image of three little girls and a broken father. "The first time I left money was 6 months after the funeral," she said. "I'd heard through the church that you were about to lose the ranch. I didn't have much. I'd been saving for years, hoping to buy a small house someday. But I had a little over 7,000 in the bank. I emptied it, put it in an envelope, and left it at the church office with a note that said, 'For the girls.' I didn't want you to know it was me. I just couldn't stand the thought of them losing their home too." I remembered that envelope, the way it had felt like a miracle. I'd never told anyone, but I'd cried in the barn that night, holding a check with no name, wondering if Sarah had somehow sent it from heaven. "It was you," I whispered. "It was me." And the well pumped 2 years later, I'd taken a second job cleaning the church on weekends, and I'd been tucking away whatever I could. I knew if the water stopped, you'd lose the cattle, and then I didn't have 11,000, I had 8. I borrowed the rest from my sister. I stared at the creek. The water was running over a branch, splitting and rejoining and splitting again. "You went into debt for us." It wasn't a question, she nodded. I never missed a payment. It's paid off now, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is why. I turned to look at her. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was bracing herself. 6 months after Sarah died, I found a journal she'd left in the church library. She'd been journaling during her pregnancy, prayers, fears, hopes. One entry was dated 2 days before the accident. She wrote, "If anything ever happens to me, I pray someone will love my girls like their own. I pray they won't forget my voice, but that another voice will hold them when I can't." Maggie's voice cracked. I read that and I felt like she was talking to me, so I started praying. Every morning I'd write prayers for Lily, for Emma, for Grace. I'd pray for their nightmares to stop. I'd pray for their father to find peace. And then I'd pray something I was ashamed to say out loud. I pray that God would let me be their mother. I remembered Lily with the journal, the careful cursive. I'd been too afraid to read it. "The prayer journal," I said. Lily found it. She saw their names. Maggie's face went pale. She did, then, after a pause. "I wrote everything I wanted to say to them if they were ever mine. I wrote letters for their birthdays, for their graduations, for their weddings. I've never told anyone." I was drowning. The donations, the journal, the midnight comfort, but there was something else Lily had said. "The foster application," I said. "Lily mentioned you filled one out to take the girls if I ever faltered." Maggie closed her eyes. When she opened them, the patience was gone, replaced by something like fear. "I did. After the second time the ranch almost failed, I started worrying that you might not make it. Not that you'd hurt them, never that. But I thought, if depression swallows you whole, if you can't get out of bed, if you lost the ranch and spiraled, someone needed to be ready to step in. So I filed a foster application with the state. I listed myself as a non-relative willing to provide kinship care for the Vale triplets. I had to prove I had a stable income, a clean record, a bedroom for each of them. I bought a house last year, small, 3 bedrooms, just in case. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel like I was waiting for you to fail. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shade. You bought a house for my children in case I couldn't keep them, and you've been tucking them in when I fall asleep in the barn. How often? How many nights did I not know? 2, sometimes 3 nights a week. You'd fall asleep in the barn after a long day, and I'd get a text from Lily on the iPad you gave her. She'd say, "Daddy's asleep again." I'd drive over, let myself in with the key you hide under the flower pot, and I'd sit with them until they fell back asleep. If they'd had a nightmare, I'd read to them. I'd sing the lullaby Sarah used to sing. I learned it from the church choir. The key under the flower pot. I'd put it there for emergencies, thinking no one knew. The girls had never told me. They had kept her secret as if their lives depended on it. I stood up, packing toward the creek. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. The anonymous miracles were human hands. The warmth I'd felt in the house on lonely mornings wasn't God's presence. It was the lingering scent of a woman who'd been there hours before, praying over my daughters while I slept. But then a darker thought surfaced. I turned back to her, my voice harder than I intended. "You said you prayed God would let you be their mother, and then Sarah died. Did you ever think your prayer caused her death?" Maggie flinched like I'd struck her. She stood up too, and for the first time I saw anger in her eyes, not at me but at herself. "Every single day," she whispered. "The night I heard about the accident, I fell on my knees and begged God to take the prayer back. I told him I didn't mean it, that I'd rather be 1,000 miles away if it meant those girls could still have their mother. I almost left town, but I couldn't, because every time I tried to run, something pulled me back. Not a voice, not a vision. Just the feeling that Sarah's prayer, her prayer for someone to love them, was a sacred trust I'd been given." She stepped closer, and now the tears were falling freely. "I didn't kill your wife, John, and I didn't wish her dead. But I have spent 6 years trying to become worthy of a prayer I never should have prayed. And if you hate me for it, I'll go. I'll disappear from their lives tonight. But know this, I will never stop loving those girls, not if I live to be 100. The silence between us was filled only by the creek and the distant gospel music. I looked at her, this woman who had poured her savings into my ranch, who had bought a house for my children, who had tucked herself into the hollow spaces of our grief, and I didn't know whether to embrace her or send her away. The revelation was too big, the reframe too sharp. The love story I'd thought was unfolding was actually a confession of divine haunting. and I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't yet name, staring at the door I'd finally opened, terrified of what might walk through next. I didn't send her away. I couldn't. Standing there by the creek with the sound of gospel music bleeding through the trees and the weight of 6 years pressing down on my chest, I couldn't say a single word that would make her leave. But I couldn't pull her close either. I was a house with every light flickering on at once, circuits overloading. Lily found us before I could decide anything. She came crashing through the undergrowth, a whirlwind of dirt-stained sundress and tangled hair, and planted herself between Maggie and me like a tiny sentinel. "Daddy, you're not being mean to her, are you?" Her chin jutted out. She was 6 years old and she was ready to fight me. For Maggie. Before I could answer, Emma and Grace appeared behind her, quieter, their faces tight with the same protective fear. They had all known. They had all participated. My daughters had been living a double life, and I had been too exhausted, too buried in my own grief to see it. I knelt down to Lily's level. "I'm not being mean, sweetheart. Miss Maggie and I are just talking." I looked past her at the two women I had married in different ways, one in a cemetery, one in secret. "Can you take your sisters back to the picnic? We'll be there in a minute." Lily didn't move. She looked at Maggie, who nodded. Only then did she turn and lead her sisters back through the trees, glancing over her shoulder twice. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I should go too. The girls are my priority, John. If you need time, take it, but please don't cut them off from me. They've already lost one mother." That word mother kindled something in me. Not anger, something rower. I had spent 4 years believing I was the sole guardian of my children's hearts, the only one standing between them and the abyss. And now I was learning that a stranger had been holding them up while I slept. "I need to see the journal," I said, my voice rough. "The prayer journal and the foster application. I need to see everything." Maggie went pale, but she nodded. "I'll bring them tonight, after the girls are in bed. You can decide then what you want to do." She turned and walked back toward the picnic, her shoulders straight even though I could see them trembling. That night I put the triplets to bed alone. They asked where Maggie was. I told them she was at home. Lily stared at me with those two old eyes and said, "She always comes when we're scared." I didn't know what to say, so I kissed her forehead and promised I'd be in the living room if they needed me. Maggie arrived at 9. She carried a cardboard box, the kind you use for filing documents, and set it on the kitchen table without a word. Then she sat down across from me, hands folded as if she were awaiting a verdict. I opened the box. The journal was on top, brown leather, soft with wear, its pages fattened by years of ink and tears. I started at the beginning. The first entry was dated 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral. Maggie had written, "I can't explain why my heart is breaking for a man I barely know and 3 little girls I've never held. Is this you, God, or am I just lonely?" I turned the pages. Months turned into years. Birthdays, first steps, first words, first nightmares. Every milestone I had recorded in my own memory, she had recorded in hers. She wrote prayers for Lily's courage, for Emma's gentleness, for Grace's silence, which she called a locked room waiting for a safe key. She wrote prayers for me too, that John would smile again, that he'd see his daughters don't need a perfect father, just a present one, that he'd forgive himself for surviving. Then I found the entry from 3 years ago. It stopped my breath. "Saw Sarah's parents at church today. They couldn't look at the girls without crying." It broke something in me. I stayed late, locked the sanctuary doors, and lay face down on the carpet in front of the altar. I told God I'd take it all back if I could. I told Sarah I was sorry. Then I felt, I can't explain it, a warmth on my shoulder like a hand. I thought it was the pastor. No one was there. Maybe it was her. Maybe I'm insane, but I'm not leaving these girls, not ever. I looked up at Maggie. She was watching me, her face unreadable. "You thought you were haunted," I said. "I still do some days." Beneath the journal I found the foster application. It was a packet nearly 2 inches thick, background check, financial statements, character references, a home study evaluation. The state seal was stamped in blue ink across the front, "Approved kinship care provider." I read the date. It had been approved 18 months ago. For 18 months, this woman had been legally vetted to take my children if I couldn't care for them. And I had no idea. Then I saw the house deed. A small 3-bedroom cottage on Elm Street, purchased 3 years ago, well before the application. She wasn't just prepared. She had built a life that had room for my daughters waiting in the wings, fully ready to step into a role she prayed she would never have to take. I closed the box. I couldn't look at any more. My head was a war zone. There was so much I still didn't understand, so I asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't you ever tell me? Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. Because you weren't ready, and because I was afraid you'd think I was trying to replace her. I'm not, John. I could never replace Sarah. I just wanted to be there if the world crashed down again. The donations, I said. The money, that was all you, not the church, not God, you. She nodded. I sold my grandmother's ring. The one thing I had left of my own family. I don't regret it. That broke something open. I didn't cry, I was too wrung out for tears, but the walls I'd built, the armor of the joke, the widower's stoicism, it all started crumbling. I couldn't look at her anymore. I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark ranch, my ranch, the one she had helped save. Did Sarah know you? I asked suddenly, the thought arriving unbidden. Before the accident, did she know you? Silence. I turned. Maggie's face had gone white. Yes, she said, the word dragged out of her like a confession. We were friends, close friends, during her pregnancy. She was scared, John. The pregnancy was high risk, triplets. She told me she had nightmares about not surviving, and she asked me something. She asked me if anything ever happened to her to watch over you, to watch over the girls. The world tilted. I gripped the windowsill. She said that to you. My voice was someone else's. 2 weeks before the accident, we were sitting in the church nursery putting together cribs. She took my hand and said, Maggie, if I'm not here, promise me you'll be the one. I've watched you with the little ones. You have a mother's heart, promise me. I laughed. I told her she'd be fine. But then she pressed a key into my palm, the one you hide under the flower pot, and said, just in case. The key under the flower pot. I'd thought it was my secret, but Sarah had placed it there knowing. She had chosen Maggie. She had chosen a successor before her body was even cold. I didn't want to tell you because I thought you'd feel betrayed, Maggie continued, her tears falling freely now. I thought you'd think I was using a dead woman's wish to insert myself into your life. But every prayer I prayed, every entry I wrote, every midnight visit, it was because I promised your wife I wouldn't let her family fall apart. And I've been keeping that promise for 6 years, even when it cost me everything. I couldn't breathe. The refrain was too massive. My wife, the love I had mourned, the ghost I had clutched as an excuse to stay closed off, had asked this woman to step into her shoes. And this woman, out of loyalty and perhaps more, had done it with such radical invisibility that I had mistaken it for divine intervention. But the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was that while I was standing there, reeling, my phone buzzed on the table, a text from an unknown number. Maggie glanced at it and her face drained of all remaining color. It's Martha, she said, Sarah's sister. She's been threatening to report me to child services for months. She thinks I'm trying to steal the girls. She must have heard about the picnic. I picked up the phone. The text read, You've been manipulating a grieving widower and his children for years. We're going to court. And just like that, my secret mother, the woman who had saved us, was facing a legal war from the only biological family my daughters had left. The clock was no longer counting down to a quiet discovery. It was counting down to a courtroom battle that could tear my girls away from the one person who had never left them. I looked at Maggie, then at the box of evidence, then at the text. And I made a decision. That night, I didn't sleep. Maggie went home to her empty cottage on Elm Street, and I sat alone in the kitchen with the box of secrets, the phone on the table still glowing with Martha's threat. At 3 in the morning, I made 2 decisions. The first was that Maggie wasn't going anywhere. Whatever legal battle was coming, she would face it with me, not as a defendant, but as the woman my daughters already called mother in secret. The second decision was harder. I would call Martha myself. Sarah's sister had always been difficult. After the funeral, she'd offered to take the girls. Just for a few months, she'd said, until John gets back on his feet. I refused. I knew those few months would stretch into years, into custody hearings, into my daughters growing up in a house where their father was reduced to a visitor. Martha never forgave me. She saw my grief as stubbornness, my determination as neglect. When she learned about Maggie, from a busybody at church who'd seen her car in my driveway at odd hours, she'd fixated on a single narrative. A lonely widow, a woman too plain to find her own family, was worming her way into my broken heart to steal 3 little girls. I called her at dawn. The conversation was brutal. She accused me of replacing Sarah before the grave was cold. She accused Maggie of being a predator. She told me she had already filed an emergency petition for temporary custody with family court, citing emotional manipulation and an unstable home environment. She had a lawyer. She had witnesses from the church who'd seen Maggie slipping into the house at night. I listened until she ran out of breath. Then I said, "Martha, I have a box of papers that will tell you a very different story. Come to the ranch on Tuesday. Bring your lawyer. I'll bring mine. And if after that you still want to tear this family apart, I'll see you in court." Tuesday arrived with a cold wind that rattled the windows. Maggie came early. She wore a simple gray dress, the same one she'd worn to Sarah's memorial, her hair pulled back tight. She looked terrified, but her voice was steady. The girls were at school. I didn't want them to hear any of this. Martha arrived at 10, a tall woman with Sarah's sharp cheekbones and none of her warmth. Her lawyer was a thin man in an expensive suit who immediately began taking notes. We sat around the kitchen table. I placed the box in the center. I started with the prayer journal, reading aloud the entry from the night after the funeral. Then the donations, the $7,000 that saved the ranch from foreclosure, the $11,000 for the well pump. I showed them the paperwork from the bank, the receipts from the contractors, and Maggie's sister's loan agreement proving she'd co-signed the debt. I showed them the foster application, the home study, the deed to the cottage. I showed them the key, Sarah's key, and told them about the promise Sarah had asked Maggie to make 2 weeks before she died. Martha's face went through stages of disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like grief. When I finished, she stared at Maggie. "You were with her before the accident. She never told me any of this." Maggie's voice was shaking. "Sarah was scared, Martha. She didn't want to burden you. You were already dealing with your own health issues, your divorce. She told me she needed someone who could focus on the girls without any family baggage. I was just the Sunday school teacher. She thought I'd be neutral." Martha laughed bitterly. "Neutral, and you took that and turned it into a 6-year campaign to replace her." "Enough." I stood up. "I loved Sarah with every fiber of my being. I still do. But Sarah chose Maggie, not to replace her. To be a backup, a safety net, someone to catch us if I fell. And I fell, Martha. I fell hard. I was so buried in grief and exhaustion that I didn't even know my daughters were texting a woman to come tuck them in. That woman never asked for money. She never asked for recognition. She never asked for anything except the chance to keep a promise to her dead friend." Martha's lawyer cleared his throat. "This is all very emotional, but the petition alleges that the children were being exposed to an unauthorized adult in their home at night without the father's knowledge. That's a legitimate safety concern." Maggie reached into the box and pulled out a sheaf of papers I hadn't seen. "These are the texts," she said quietly. "Every message Lily sent me over the years, begging me to come. She was having night terrors. She'd hear her mother crying in her dreams. And this," she slid a letter across the table, "is a letter from the girls' pediatrician, documenting their anxiety and recommending consistent nighttime comfort from a trusted adult. I became that adult because no one else was available. I never entered that house without the children's explicit request and knowledge. If that's a crime, then arrest me." Martha read the texts. She read the pediatrician's letter. The hardness in her face began to crack. The lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice suddenly smaller. "Why didn't John know?" "Because I was afraid of exactly this," Maggie said. "I was afraid the family would see me as a threat, that they'd use my love as a weapon against me. I thought if I stayed invisible long enough, the girls would grow up secure and John would eventually see the truth on his own. I was wrong. I should have told everyone from the beginning. I was just a coward." I reached across the table and took Maggie's hand. "You're not a coward. You're the bravest person I've ever met." The lawyer closed his briefcase. "Mrs. Henderson," he said to Martha, "I don't think we have a case here. This looks like a woman who stepped into a crisis role with the complete trust of the children and a deceased mother's blessing. I'd recommend we withdraw the petition." Martha didn't answer immediately. She looked at Maggie, then at me, then at the box. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was raw. "I was so angry after Sarah died. I wanted to take the girls because they were all I had left of her. When I found out about you, I thought you were stealing them from me too. I didn't know. I didn't know she chose you." She stood up, her eyes wet. "I'll withdraw the petition, but I want to be part of their lives, not just holidays. Real time. Can you promise me that?" I looked at Maggie. She nodded. "They need their aunt," Maggie said. "They need everyone who loved their mother." That's what Sarah would have wanted. Martha left that afternoon, the legal threat dissolved, but the weight of the revelation settled into our lives in unexpected ways. Over the next few weeks, the church community absorbed the truth of what Maggie had done. Some people praised her, others whispered. A few accused her of being obsessive, of crossing boundaries. The same women who had once smiled at her in the Sunday school room now avoided her eyes. It hurt her, I could see it, but she never complained. She just kept showing up for the girls, for me, for the quiet work of stitching together a broken family. Then, 3 weeks after Martha's visit, something extraordinary happened. I was cleaning out Sarah's old Hope chest, which I hadn't opened since the funeral. At the bottom, underneath baby blankets and maternity clothes, I found a sealed envelope. It was addressed to Maggie, in Sarah's handwriting. I drove to her cottage that evening and handed it to her without a word. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter written 2 days before the accident. It said, "Dear Maggie, if you're reading this, then the thing I was afraid of happened. I need you to know that I've watched you with children and I've seen a mother's heart. John is a good man, but he's fragile. He'll try to do everything alone. He'll bury himself in work and grief, and he won't see what's right in front of him. Be patient with him. The girls will love you, I can already tell. Don't be afraid of what people will say. I give you my blessing to love them, to hold them, to be whatever they need you to be. You're not replacing me. You're completing what I couldn't finish. With all my love, Sarah." Maggie broke down completely. I held her on the floor of her cottage, surrounded by the evidence of 6 years of secret devotion, and I realized that the joke I'd told at the picnic wasn't just wrong. It was the opposite of the truth. The truth was, Sarah had prayed for someone to mother her girls before she died, and God had sent Maggie, not as a replacement, but as an answer to a prayer whispered in a hospital room. The Sunday after Maggie read the letter, we stood up in church during the sharing time. I told the congregation everything: the donations, the midnight visits, the prayer journal, the foster application, Sarah's blessing. When I finished, the sanctuary was silent. Then Pastor Bill stood and said, "I've known Maggie for 7 years. She's never asked for recognition. She's never sought the spotlight. But today, I think we're all seeing what sacrificial love actually looks like." The congregation rose to their feet, not in applause, but in a kind of reverent acknowledgement. Maggie stood beside me, tears streaming, and for the first time, she wasn't hiding. 2 months later, we sat on the same porch where I had once told my tired joke to half a dozen church acquaintances. The sun was setting over the ranch, painting the fields gold. The triplets were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter floating up on the summer air. Maggie was beside me, her hand in mine, a quiet presence that no longer felt like a secret. I turned to her. I used to say no woman in her right mind wanted to be mom to triplets by dinner. I was wrong. One woman did. She just had to wait 6 years for me to realize it. Maggie smiled, that same steadiness in her eyes that had stopped my breath at the picnic. "I'd wait 100 more," she said. And standing there, watching our daughters dance in the twilight, I understood that the joke hadn't been armor at all. It had been a prayer in reverse, a hope I was too afraid to speak aloud, that someone might actually want us, all of us, the broken man and his 3 fierce little girls. The prayer had been answered long before I found the courage to pray it. I was just the last one to see it. That was the moment I realized I'd been telling myself the wrong story for 4 years. The joke wasn't armor. It was a locked door. And the key had been in my daughter's hands the entire time, placed there by a woman who never asked for anything but the chance to keep a promise. The question that haunted me for weeks afterward was simple. How many of us are walking around with the same locked door? How many of us dismiss the quiet people who show up again and again, calling it charity or coincidence, when it's actually an answered prayer we were too proud or too wounded to whisper? Maggie's story isn't just about a man who found love after loss. It's about what we miss when we're surviving instead of living. 6 years of anonymous donations. A foster application signed and sealed, ready for a disaster that never came. A cottage with 3 empty bedrooms waiting. And the whole time my daughters knew. Children don't have the armor we do. They saw a mother where I saw a Sunday school teacher. They felt safety where I felt obligation. They called it love before I could even say the word aloud. Sarah's letter changed everything, but not because it gave permission. It changed things because it revealed that the miracle hadn't started after her death. It had started before. 2 women, one dying and one unknown, had conspired across the boundary of life and death to protect 3 little girls. That's not coincidence. That's grace with a human face. If there's one thing I want people to take from this, it's that the biggest gifts often arrive without fanfare. They come in the form of a quiet coworker who remembers your kids' names, a neighbor who shovels your walk without being asked, a friend who texts at midnight because she felt you needed it. Maggie was that kind of gift, but I almost missed her because I was convinced I didn't deserve one. So ask yourself, is there a Maggie in your life? Someone who's been quietly holding space for you, waiting for you to wake up. Maybe they're not as dramatic as a secret mother of triplets, but maybe they've been paying for your coffee, praying for your peace, or simply believing in you when you couldn't. Don't wait 6 years to see it. Don't let your best gifts go unacknowledged because you're too afraid to hope. As for our family, the girls are 8 now. Maggie officially adopted them last spring in a courthouse ceremony that packed the room with everyone who had ever whispered about us. Martha stood in the front row, holding the old prayer journal, crying and laughing at the same time. Lily still tells the story of how she helped her secret mommy get found. Emma says Maggie was always their real mom. They just had to teach their dad to notice. And Grace, my silent one, finally started speaking without fear, because now she knows some things are worth saying out loud. The ranch is thriving. The well pump still works. And every night I fall asleep beside the woman who once tucked in my children while I slept in the barn. I don't tell the old joke anymore. Instead, I tell the truth. I'm the luckiest father on earth because my daughters got 2 mothers who loved them, one from heaven and one who waited 6 years on earth, praying I'd turn around and see what was already there. If this story gave you goosebumps or made you think about the quiet heroes in your own life, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that hope isn't always loud. And if you want more true stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary love, hit subscribe. We'll be here with the next one.